Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Sunday, January 18th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. Expect a pleasant high of 75.5 degrees in Riverside today, with the low settling at 57.2 degrees, ideal for a sunny Sunday outing. Coming up, we'll examine why Venezuela's top enforcer has seized control in the wake of Maduro's recent U.S. raid, and unpack how President Trump's aggressive immigration push in the Twin Cities is fueling widespread chaos and deep divisions. Plus, other key stories on global tensions, domestic policy shifts, and more. All this and beyond on Alex's News. Stay with us. We begin this half hour in Venezuela, where the capture of Nicolas Maduro has not ended the grip of his inner circle. Reporter Ethan Morales is with us. Ethan, take us back to that raid earlier this month. What exactly did the United States do on January 3rd?
According to Reuters and the BBC, the Pentagon launched what it called Operation Absolute Resolve, a lightning assault on Maduro's compound in Caracas just over 2 weeks ago on January 3rd. More than 150 aircraft were used to blind and neutralize Venezuelan air defenses, while Delta Force soldiers and CIA operatives stormed his heavily fortified residence inside the Fort Tiuna military base. Town Hall's detailed account says roughly 83 people were killed, including 47 Venezuelan soldiers and 32 Cuban troops embedded with Maduro's security detail. The whole ground operation lasted under an hour, and then Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores were flown out by helicopter and eventually taken to a United States Navy ship bound for New York.
So he's now in New York facing charges. What has happened to Maduro and his inner circle legally since that raid?
They were brought into federal court in Lower Manhattan on January 5th, and both Maduro and Cilia Flores pleaded not guilty. The case is built on a Justice Department indictment first issued back in 2020, accusing them of narco-terrorism, massive cocaine trafficking, and running the so-called Cartel de los Soles, a drug network entwined with top generals. NPR's Venezuela coverage points out that President Trump oversaw the raid from Mar-a-Lago, flanked by Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller. Rubio insisted it was, quote, not a war, end quote. But Democrats in Congress argue it's an unconstitutional use of force, and they've pushed war powers votes to rein the operation in.
And yet, even with Maduro gone, the regime's machinery is still very much there. The big name now is Diosdado Cabello. Who is he?
Cabello is 62, a former military officer, and one of Hugo Chávez's closest protégés, often described as the regime's enforcer-in-chief. As interior minister, he controls the national police, domestic intelligence, and the feared colectivos, those armed motorcycle gangs that have terrorized protesters for years. NPR's State of the World podcast calls him a hardliner from the Chávez inner circle, the man who actually controls the streets. He was second only to Maduro on that United States narco-trafficking indictment and has a United States bounty of $25 million on his head.
And yet he's not in custody. How is he still operating, and how secure is he right now?
The Miami Herald reports that since the raid, he's been living in what aides describe as survival mode. He constantly shifts safe houses, moves with about 30 trusted gunmen and roughly 220 Presidential Honor Guard troops, and appears on state television in a bulletproof vest and helmet. Despite the bounty and the indictment, he's still the interior minister, the man with the guns inside this interim government. Think of him as the nerve center of the regime's security apparatus, even with Maduro sitting in a New York jail.
Part of his power has been his ability to dominate the airwaves. What does he do on television, and why does it matter?
Every week, he hosts a show on state television called Con el Mazo Dando, which translates roughly as bringing down the hammer. He sits behind a desk with a gavel, reading out names of enemies, taunting dissidents, and making veiled threats, turning the program into a ritual of intimidation. Analysts at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies say this is not just propaganda, it's a tool for surveillance and control, because people know he often reads out information gathered by intelligence agents. They argue Cabello is effectively the intelligence chief of a narco-state and a major danger to any real democratic transition.
Over the weekend, we got new reporting about secret contacts between Cabello and the Trump administration. What did we learn?
Reuters published an exclusive on January 17th, saying Cabello had been in quiet back-channel talks with United States officials for months before the raid. Those contacts reportedly began in early 2025 and were used to warn him not to unleash his forces against any American operation targeting Maduro. Town Hall, which has also spoken with unnamed United States officials, characterizes it as a calculated betrayal, saying Cabello deliberately ordered many of his colectivos and intelligence units to stand down that night. NPR's reporting notes how unusually passive Venezuela's security forces were during the assault, which is part of why the casualty toll, while tragic, was not even higher.
That raises the question, what did the United States put on the table in those back-channel talks, and what did it threaten?
According to FDD experts and the Miami Herald's sources, Washington offered what they call conditional tolerance. In other words, they would not immediately move to remove Cabello, but they kept the $25 million bounty in place and made clear he could still end up on a plane to New York. Trump's national security team, including Marco Rubio as National Security Advisor and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, sent a blunt message through intermediaries: cooperate with the transition, or, quote, you will be fast-tracked to New York like Maduro, end quote. The BBC highlights the paradox here, that Washington is effectively managing a delicate balancing act with an indicted narcotics kingpin, because the alternative might be a bloody civil war.
Let's talk about the political leadership on paper. With Maduro gone, who's actually running Venezuela right now?
Venezuela's Supreme Court swore in Vice President Delcy Rodriguez as interim president on January 5th, just days after the raid. She's Maduro's vice president, his sister-in-law, and a former foreign and oil minister. And NPR and the Associated Press say the Trump administration has quietly backed her, seeing her as more technocratic and pragmatic. To show that, she ordered the release of more than 200 opposition figures, activists, journalists, and foreign detainees on January 9th, calling it a gesture for peace. But both NPR and the Miami Herald emphasize that over 800 political prisoners remain behind bars as of yesterday, so it's at best a partial opening.
So how are power and responsibility divided between Rodriguez and Cabello in this interim setup?
Formally, Rodriguez is the head of state, giving speeches, meeting foreign envoys, and courting international lenders and oil companies. In practice, Cabello still controls the Interior Ministry, the police, intelligence, and with Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez, most of the armed forces. AOL, citing analyst Elizabeth Dickinson of the International Crisis Group, notes that Cabello's men are securing critical oil infrastructure like the state firm PDVSA's facilities, ensuring there's no immediate vacuum around the wells and pipelines. The Miami Herald describes a dangerous rivalry emerging, with Rodriguez trying to install her loyalists in military counterintelligence to dilute Cabello's power, while he rallies hardcore Chavistas and quietly keeps those United States channels open.
Energy is at the center of this story. What's the Trump administration aiming to do with Venezuela's oil sector and sanctions now?
In a speech on January 5th, Trump said the United States would, quote, run Venezuela, end quote, explicitly invoking the Monroe Doctrine as a justification, according to NPR and Reuters. He's promised that American firms will rebuild Venezuela's crumbling oil industry in under 18 months, in exchange for lifting or easing sanctions so that heavy Venezuelan crude can again flow to United States refineries. Financial reporters, including those syndicated by AOL from Fortune, note that Wall Street cheered the prospect of new oil supplies. The Dow hit record highs on January 6th and 7th, driven in part by energy and logistics stocks. At the same time, NPR points out there are investigations into possible insider trading after a polymarket trader made about $400,000 correctly betting on Maduro's capture.
This operation hasn't just been controversial on moral or political grounds, it's raised serious legal questions. Internationally, what are world leaders and legal experts saying about the raid?
UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has called it a dangerous precedent that undercuts the United Nations Charter's ban on the use of force, as quoted by Reuters and the BBC. Legal scholars like Una Hathaway at Yale and Mark Weller at Chatham House argue the United States cannot credibly claim self-defense here, and that Maduro still enjoyed head of state immunity under International Court of Justice precedents. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and UN Special Rapporteur Ben Saul have criticized the action as illegal, saying it violates state sovereignty and could normalize cross-border manhunts for political leaders. Regionally, Mexico condemned the raid, Argentina's libertarian President Javier Milei praised it, and Russia, China, and Iran all denounced it, especially after a Russian-linked oil tanker, the Minerva Astra, was seized and then lost during a North Atlantic chase on January 7th.
And within the United States, there's been a fierce debate about presidential war powers. How does this operation fit or not fit into existing authorizations?
Analysts at Lawfare Just Security and the Brennan Center, including Scott R. Anderson, say it simply does not fit. The administration argues this was essentially a law enforcement action against a foreign terrorist organization. Since the Cartel de los Soles and the gang Tren de Aragua have that designation, but critics say that's a stretch for a large military raid. It does not fall neatly under the post-September 11th authorizations for use of military force, and the White House only sent a War Powers Resolution notification to Congress on January 5th, after the fact. The Senate actually advanced a resolution to limit operations on January 8th by a 52-47 vote, but a later vote on January 14th deadlocked. The vice president broke the tie against it, and Trump has threatened to veto, so for now the mission stands.
Some people have compared this to the invasion of Panama and the capture of Manuel Noriega in 1989. Is that a fair comparison?
Experts told Reuters the Panama analogy is partly right, but only up to a point. In both cases, you have a United States military operation that seizes a foreign leader, who is then tried in an American court, raising what lawyers call male captus benedictentis, questions about jurisdiction. The difference is scale and context. Operation Absolute Resolve was far more surgical than the Panama invasion. But Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch argue that in today's multipolar world, it may erode global norms even more. Their concern is that if Washington normalizes this, other powers might feel freer to conduct their own cross-border raids to grab political enemies.
Let's bring this back to ordinary Venezuelans, both inside the country and those who fled. How are they being affected by all this, as of today?
Venezuela was already in deep humanitarian crisis, with years of hyperinflation, food and medicine shortages, and millions fleeing, some literally hunting zoo animals to survive at the worst point, as FDD has documented. NPR notes that hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans in the United States lost their temporary protected status in 2025 when Trump rolled it back, and now officials are quietly encouraging some to return. Miami's mayor-elect Eileen Higgins called that policy, quote, reckless, end quote, on January 4th, arguing that sending people back in the middle of a power struggle is dangerous. Meanwhile, there are anti-Maduro protests outside the White House and the New York courthouse, pro-Maduro rallies in Caracas and Havana, and opposition leader Maria Corina Machado says in NPR interviews that she feels sidelined by an interim process still dominated by authoritarian figures.
Given all of that, let's come back to the man we started with. Where does Diosdado Cabello stand right now, on January 18th, and what are the scenarios going forward?
FDD's analysts say Cabello is in a precarious but central position. Washington wants to neutralize his colectivos and secure the oil sector before moving decisively against him. Reuters and the BBC describe him as a stability broker for the Trump administration, someone they are tolerating in the short term to keep the security forces coherent. Town Hall frames the whole operation as a warning shot to other authoritarian leaders in Cuba, Iran, and Russia, arguing it proves dictators can be reached anywhere. But NPR and other independent outlets caution that unless Cabello and other hardliners are either integrated into a negotiated transition or eventually removed without triggering a military split, Venezuela could lurch from dictatorship into prolonged chaos rather than real democracy.
And for listeners who want to track this story, what sources are you watching most closely?
I'm following NPR's dedicated Venezuela coverage, which gives excellent on-the-ground context and voices from across the spectrum. Reuters is crucial for detailed accounts of the back-channel diplomacy and the legal fallout, and the BBC helps with the broader international reaction. The Miami Herald has deep reporting from the Venezuelan diaspora in South Florida, while think tanks like the Foundation for Defense of Democracies are closely tracking Cabello and the security services. Together, they paint a picture of a country caught between dramatic external intervention and very entrenched internal power.
A complicated, high-stakes story, and it's still unfolding. Ethan Morales, thanks for walking us through it.
Thank you, Grace.
The Twin Cities have suddenly become the center of the nation's immigration fight. Chloe is following this massive federal crackdown in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Chloe, what's happening there right now?
Grace, this is the most aggressive federal immigration sweep of the Trump presidency so far, according to detailed reporting from the Associated Press. It's called Operation Metro Surge, and it kicked off in early January, just a couple of weeks ago. Between roughly 2,000 and 3,000 federal agents from ICE, Border Protection, and Homeland Security investigations have flooded a metro area of just over 3 million people. The AP describes it as turning daily life into a constant mix of fear, street clashes, and legal showdowns.
That's a huge force for one metro area. What does this operation actually look like, day to day on the ground?
The AP story, which ran in outlets like ABC News and the Los Angeles Times, describes a very specific rhythm. At sunrise, hundreds of agents in tactical gear pour out of the Bishop Henry Whipple Federal Building near the airport, loading into unmarked SUVs, pickups, and minivans. These so-called ghost-like teams fan out into immigrant neighborhoods, making very fast arrests from cars and homes before protesters can fully assemble. Because you can drive across Minneapolis in about 15 minutes, residents say the federal presence feels inescapable in a way it hasn't in bigger cities like Los Angeles or Chicago.
And what is the official reason the Department of Homeland Security is giving for sending so many agents there?
Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem points to what she calls a widening fraud scandal in Minnesota, including fallout from the high-profile Feeding Our Future nutrition fraud case. DHS says visa and benefit scams are rampant and claims more than 2,500 arrests already, insisting they are going after what they call criminal illegal aliens, like gang members and violent offenders. But independent research from the University of California, Berkeley's Deportation Data Project, cited by NPR and The Washington Post, shows more than one-third of those detained have no criminal record at all. That gap has fueled accusations that this is a numbers game, not a targeted public safety effort.
Given that, why the Twin Cities? Why not put those agents on the southern border or larger immigrant hubs?
Local reporting in the Star Tribune notes that Minnesota's undocumented population is smaller than in states like Texas or Arizona, which have actually received far fewer surge agents. The federal government points to internal estimates of visa fraud rates in Minnesota as high as 50%, though those numbers are contested. In a January 18th analysis, The Guardian quoted legal scholars from Georgetown and the University of Chicago, who argue this uneven deployment violates the spirit of what's known as the equal sovereignty doctrine from the Shelby County voting rights case. They frame the surge as political payback against a blue sanctuary-leaning region with a long history of immigrant advocacy.
How are state and local leaders responding to that kind of pressure and that many federal officers?
Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey has been blunt, telling the Star Tribune that this feels like an invasion when the city has only about 600 police officers of its own. He says just the sheer number of federal agents creates chaos that local law enforcement is left to manage. Governor Tim Walz, a Democrat and outspoken critic of President Trump, told PBS NewsHour he's furious about the disruption but is pleading with residents to keep protests peaceful. Walz worries that any large-scale unrest could give the White House a pretext to invoke the Insurrection Act and send in troops without the state's consent.
You mentioned protests. What are those demonstrations looking and feeling like on a typical day now?
According to the AP's on-the-ground accounts, protests now basically bookend the operation. At dawn, crowds gather outside the Whipple building chanting, quote, "Ice out," end quote, "go home," end quote, as the convoys roll out. After dark, things usually escalate. Protesters rattle the perimeter fences, block intersections with makeshift barricades, and use bullhorns and air raid-style whistles to alert neighborhoods when federal vehicles are moving. The Miles City Star, which runs national wire coverage, notes those confrontations have spilled into Somali business corridors, where anti-ICE crowds sometimes chase off pro-enforcement demonstrators and conservative live streamers amid damaged federal vehicles and graffiti.
How are agents responding to that kind of resistance in the streets?
Protesters and witnesses told the AP and the Los Angeles Times that federal teams often respond with tear gas, flashbang grenades, and pepper spray, even breaking the windows of civilian cars caught in the wrong place. Most incidents end in shouted insults, minor injuries, and vandalism, not serious physical harm, but hundreds of people have been detained, including U.S. citizens. Some are held for days before being released without charges. Activists say the nightly rhythm of sirens, helicopters overhead, and chemical agents has created what one organizer described to ABC News as a low-level siege.
This operation also includes a deadly incident that's drawn national attention. Who was Renee Good, and what happened to her?
On January 7th, about 11 days ago, ICE agent Jonathan Ross fatally shot 37-year-old Renee Nicole Good near 34th Street and Portland Avenue, just blocks from where George Floyd was murdered in 2020. Good was a U.S. citizen, a poet, and a mother of three. DHS statements reported by CBS News and Time magazine say she weaponized her Honda Pilot, tried to run Ross over, and that he fired in self-defense amid what they labeled a mob of agitators. President Trump echoed that on X, saying she viciously ran over the agent, and Vice President J.D. Vance cited an earlier 2025 incident in which Ross was dragged by a fleeing motorist to justify what he called a hyper-reactive response.
That's the official version. How does it compare to what independent investigations have found?
A New York Times video investigation, published just 2 days ago, analyzed Ross's cell phone footage alongside several bystander videos and came to a very different conclusion. The Times found Ross was not in the path of the SUV. Instead, Good was slowly performing a three-point turn to get away from traffic, steering away from him. Frame by frame, her wheels are turned out, away from Ross, when he fires 3 shots through the driver's side window as the vehicle passes. A separate three-dimensional reconstruction by the Paris-based group Index, covered by PBS, also shows Ross standing to the side and then walking away uninjured after the shooting.
What do the medical findings and eyewitness accounts tell us about that moment?
Medical reports from the Minneapolis Fire Department and Police Department, released last week and reported by Minnesota Public Radio and the Star Tribune, say Good was hit twice in the right chest, once in the left forearm, and once in the left side of her head. Forensics experts say that pattern fits shots fired into the side of a car, not into an oncoming vehicle. 911 logs show a DHS caller describing agents trapped by agitators, while neighborhood callers describe a woman shot at point-blank range while sitting in her car. Witnesses quoted in the Washington Post say agents shouted conflicting commands, one telling Good to drive away, another ordering her out, and that moments before the shots she calmly said, quote, "I'm not mad at you," end quote.
And how are police and use of force experts interpreting whether that shooting was justified?
Analysts interviewed by NPR emphasize that even a light brush with a vehicle, which the videos do not clearly show anyway, does not typically justify deadly force once the car is moving away and the officer is no longer in danger. They stress that standard training expects officers to step aside rather than shoot into a retreating driver. That's why this case is reopening deep trauma in Minneapolis, which is still living with the legacy of George Floyd's killing. Flowers, murals, and vigils now mark the spot where Good died, and activists told the AP the city's rage could ignite again, though many are determined not to repeat the billion-dollar destruction of 2020.
Has there been any formal recognition of Renee Good from state leaders?
Yes, Governor Walz moved quickly to acknowledge her death publicly. He declared January 9th as Renee Good Day in Minnesota, something Minnesota Public Radio reported on extensively. Supporters say the proclamation, while symbolic, signals that state officials do not accept the federal narrative at face value. It has also become a rallying point for organizers who link Good's death to a broader pattern of federal overreach.
Let's talk about the legal backlash. What are Minnesota and the Twin Cities doing in the courts to push back on Operation Metro Surge?
On January 12th, just 6 days ago, Minnesota, Minneapolis, and St. Paul filed a joint lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security. They argue the operation violates the 10th Amendment's anti-commandeering doctrine, which the Supreme Court reinforced in a 2018 sports betting case called Murphy v. NCAA. A Cato Institute analysis, cited by the legal outlet Jurist, notes that the lawsuit says the federal government is effectively conscripting or punishing local governments for their policies on immigrants. The plaintiffs are asking a federal court to rein in the scale and methods of the surge.
And beyond that big lawsuit, there was a major ruling last week on how agents can treat protesters. What did the judge decide?
On January 16th, U.S. District Judge Catherine Menendez issued a preliminary injunction in a case called Tincher v. Noam, case number 0:25-CV-4669. According to coverage in the Star Tribune and Bring Me the News, the order bars federal agents from using tear gas or other chemical irritants on people who are peacefully protesting, and from making retaliatory arrests of people who are simply observing or recording them. It also forbids traffic stops of drivers who are safely following convoys, a tactic used by activist groups, sometimes called ICE chasers. Legal analysts say the ruling echoes court limits placed on unmarked federal arrests during the 2020 Portland protests.
Are there other civil rights or oversight actions tied to this surge?
The American Civil Liberties Union has filed a class action suit accusing federal agents of racial profiling, saying people of color are being stopped and questioned without cause. At the same time, the Justice Department has opened investigations into Governor Walz and Mayor Frey for what it calls possible obstruction of federal operations. Local station KAR-11 and the Star Tribune report that pressure from Washington to prioritize cases against activists, including Renee Good's widow, Becca, has led to at least 6 senior resignations in Minnesota's U.S. Attorney's Office. One of those who stepped down, fraud prosecutor Joe Thompson, reportedly objected to sidelining any investigation of Agent Ross.
Those court orders you mentioned are already in effect. Are agents actually following them yet?
So far, compliance looks very spotty. Judge Menendez gave federal agencies 72 hours to circulate the injunction, and that deadline ends tomorrow, January 19th, according to filings reviewed by Al Jazeera. But the Star Tribune reports that, even after the ruling, agents in South Minneapolis have been seen breaking car windows and using pepper spray in situations that witnesses say were peaceful. That has civil rights lawyers warning that the next legal fight may simply be over whether federal officers will obey a federal judge.
What about the investigation into Renee Good's death? Who's in charge, and what access do state officials have?
The FBI has taken control of the Good investigation, which means the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, or BCA, does not control key evidence like the vehicle, the gun, or many witness interviews. The BCA actually pulled out of the case back on January 8th, saying it could not meet its standards without that access. In response, Attorney General Keith Ellison and Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty announced a public evidence portal covered by The Guardian, asking residents to upload any video or testimony they have. It's an unusual step that underscores how little trust there is between state and federal investigators right now.
Let's zoom back out to everyday life. How is this affecting schools and families in the Twin Cities?
Minneapolis public schools have had to shut down campuses or move classes online on certain days when convoys are expected nearby, according to district records cited by the Star Tribune. Parents now organize informal patrols outside schools like Roosevelt High, watching for unmarked SUVs and texting alerts if they see a surge. Some families are keeping kids home altogether, especially in immigrant communities that already feel over-policed. Teachers say the anxiety is showing up in classrooms, with students asking whether it's safe to ride the bus or walk home.
And what about small businesses in the broader local economy? What are they seeing?
The AP's reporting, syndicated through ABC News and the Los Angeles Times, paints a stark picture along corridors like Lake Street and in the Midway area. At the ice cream shop La Michoacana Pura Pizza, they now admit just one customer at a time and keep the doors locked between visits. Taqueria Los Ocampo is closed completely because of what owners call current conditions, and at Carmel Mall, a major Somali hub, signs warn federal agents they need a warrant to enter. Business owners in Midway and Cedar Riverside tell local reporters their revenue has dropped between 50% and 80%, while city filings show more than 3,000 police overtime hours and roughly $2 million spent dealing with the fallout.
Can you share one personal story that shows how tense these encounters have become?
One that stands out comes from a suburban resident named Christian Molina, who looks Hispanic but is not undocumented. He told the Los Angeles Times he was driving to a mechanic when federal vehicles suddenly boxed him in and one rammed his car. Molina refused to show papers without regular police present, and what followed was a tear gas-filled standoff that left him asking, quote, "Who's going to pay for my car?" end quote. His story captures what many legal residents and citizens are saying, that everyday errands now carry a risk of getting swept up in an operation they have nothing to do with.
Despite all that, we're also hearing about neighbors stepping up for each other. What kind of mutual aid and community support are you seeing?
Governor Walz, in a January 17th address on Minnesota Public Radio, urged residents to respond with what he called Minnesota niceness, suggesting simple things like shoveling a neighbor's walk or volunteering at a food shelf. And people are doing that and more. The Star Tribune profiled a group called Open Market MN that packed food boxes for more than 100 families in a St. Paul church basement last week, as requests for help soared. Across Minneapolis, neighbors are blowing whistles when they spot federal convoys, offering rides to elders who are afraid to drive, and handing out water and milk to flush eyes after tear gas.
Finally, Chloe, what are the broader implications here? What does this operation mean for immigration enforcement and constitutional limits going forward?
Legal scholars point back to a 2012 Supreme Court case, Arizona versus United States, which affirmed that the federal government controls immigration enforcement but still has to follow constitutional protections. The American Immigration Council warns that using large-scale enforcement as a tool to punish political opponents, or even threatening unilateral military deployments, like President Trump did in comments on January 15th, could invite new Supreme Court scrutiny. Historians are comparing this to past invocations of the Insurrection Act during the Civil Rights era and the 1992 Los Angeles riots, saying we may be seeing a new test of how far presidents can push federal force internally. And as AP reporter Tim Sullivan wrote in the piece published just yesterday, this campaign of organized brutality, as activists call it, has locked diverse city neighborhoods into daily fear, while leaving many suburbs relatively untouched, deepening America's divide over who belongs.
A complicated, volatile situation with a lot of lives caught in the middle. Chloe, thanks for walking us through all of it. Here are some other headlines. In Asunción, it was mate and market access as the European Union and the Mercosur bloc, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, finally inked a landmark free trade agreement on Saturday, January 17, 2026, capping more than 25 years of stop-and-go talks. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called it a clear choice of fair trade over tariffs and a vital strategic partnership in an age of rising protectionism, or, put another way, Brussels chose trade over tirades. The pact will scrap over 90% of tariffs, stitching together one of the world's largest free trade zones, serving about 700 million consumers and roughly a quarter of global GDP. An interim trade agreement will fast-track tariff cuts on industrial and agricultural goods, while a broader partnership agreement winds its way through national parliaments. A new mobility chapter promises smoother business visas for executives and investors, greasing the wheels and the visas of commerce. Big winners are expected to be Europe's automotive and pharmaceutical sectors, and South America's farm exporters. But European farming lobbies are plowing up resistance, echoed by a minority of EU states, including France and Austria. The deal now heads to the European Parliament around January 21st, with backers hoping for full implementation by late 2026 or early 2027, if politics doesn't slam on the brakes. In Uganda, democracy is on the ropes as the Electoral Commission declared President Yoweri Museveni the winner of the 2026 election, extending his roughly 40-year grip on power with 71.65% of the vote, about 7.9 million ballots. His main challenger, Robert Kyagulanyi, better known as Bobi Wine, scored 24.72% and denounced the result as fake and fraudulent. The vote played out under a nationwide internet blackout, leaving citizens buffering for truth, while biometric voter verification kits reportedly failed in many opposition strongholds. Failures, the opposition says, open the door to massive ballot stuffing. Post-election clashes between security forces and opposition supporters left at least 7 to 12 people dead. Bobi Wine says he was driven into hiding after a military raid on his home, and his National Unity platform walked out of the tally center in protest as results trickled in over roughly 48 hours. The outcome cements Museveni as one of Africa's longest-serving leaders and signals a deepening democratic crisis, with heavy security, possible court challenges, and fresh diplomatic strains all on the horizon. In northwest Syria, Operation Hawkeye Strike is keeping militants firmly in its sights. U.S. Central Command says a retaliatory airstrike Friday killed Bilal Hassan al-Jassim, a senior al-Qaeda-linked figure tied to the December 13, 2025 ambush near Palmyra that killed 2 U.S. soldiers, Sergeant Edgar Brian Torres Tovar and Sergeant William Nathaniel Howard, and an American interpreter. It's the third round of strikes under Hawkeye, which has now hit more than 100 militant infrastructure and weapons sites. The campaign, ordered by President Donald Trump, comes as Washington deepens cooperation with Syria's new government under Ahmad al-Sharaa, who replaced Bashar al-Assad in late 2024, aiming to keep ISIS and al-Qaeda from regrouping, while reshaping a volatile regional playbook. Back on home soil but headed for lunar frontiers, NASA rolled the Artemis II space launch system and Orion spacecraft to launch Pad 39B on January 17th, the 322-foot rocket crawling 4 miles in about 11 hours to its seaside stage. NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman and the 4-person crew watched the slow-motion moonwalk as Launch Director Charlie Blackwell Thompson set sights on a critical February 2nd wet dress rehearsal fueling test. If all systems stay go, the earliest launch window opens February 6th. Artemis II will be the first crewed lunar-bound mission on the pad since Apollo 17 in 1972. A 10-day moon flyby designed to stress-test Orion's life support systems before an attempted Artemis III landing targeted for 2027. The stakes are high. One small test for a rocket, one giant leap for schedule reliability. And in Taiwan, a spy drama has burst from the front page to the front line. Authorities have detained Lin Chen-yu, a political reporter with CTI-TV, accused of bribing 5 current and retired military officers to leak classified information to Chinese individuals. Prosecutors say Lin allegedly acted as a middleman, paying from thousands to tens of thousands of new Taiwan dollars for insider intel, while a Marine Corps officer is suspected of filming a paid pledge of allegiance to China. Raids on multiple homes ended with Lin and 5 others held incommunicado. CTI-TV has confirmed its reporter's detention, but is calling for a fair judicial process, as Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense highlights ramped-up education against Beijing's infiltration tactics. It's a rare case where the alleged mole also holds a microphone, underscoring how China's pressure is testing not only barracks and ministries, but the media itself under Taiwan's National Security Act. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.